Hello, RH Cordia. Today we will be having a formal debate between myself, the Prime Minister, and one of the justices, Zeon, about whether it would be a good idea for RH Cord to join the EU. We will begin with Zeon's statement, then I will do a statement, and then we will do that one more time before we conclude our debate. So,
The
we shall begin with Zeon.
Thank you, Prime
Also,
Minister Crazy Historian. As stated,
Prime
I am
Minister.
Justice Zeon, and I will be here advocating against joining the EU. To begin with,
Alright, I start the timer.
the time I started, thank you again, Prime Minister. I believe that we should not join the EU due to their failures regarding Eastern security in the past. As we've seen in Eastern Europe, the EU focused on its members rather than as it promised to stand up for Eastern Europe. And this is not a new trend in terms of EU or broadly speaking the West breaking its promises. This was seen in the interwar years before the Second World War with Nazi Germany, wherein the West abandoned its commitments in favor of buying time. And again, we see it here that the West is more than willing to throw out those who are not part of their core focus in order to buy time for themselves. And additionally, I believe that we would be no different in this case, since if Eastern Europe, a place has long since been the crossroads of many different Western European nations' interests, can be abandoned, so can we, a nation in the Balkans that has historically been considered the poorest and most unstable. However, this is not the reason why I believe that joining the EU would be folly. The reason why I believe joining the EU is folly is that they have shown that they are not committed to their members, even those in Western Europe, as evidenced by the partitioning of Belgium. As if they were truly committed to their neighbors, stabilizing efforts would have been made to help keep Belgium intact rather than partitioning it along ethnic or rather linguistic lines. So, how does that tie back to Arch Quarter? Looking at our neighbors, other neighbors who have ethnic peoples in our lands. What's to say the EU, in a bid to gain them as part of the EU, doesn't promise them lands from us, and then what do we do in that situation? We'd be forced to comply, or else we lose whatever benefits the EU has been dangling over our heads. A true carrot and stick situation, in my opinion. For my last point, I'd like to add on how the EU, apart from simply not upholding its promises, not showing its true commitment to its members, is also controlling. It is increasingly in this natalist world taking on a more of a military role and enforcing its influence across the world rather than simply being a matter of economic cooperation and an organization for peace. This is not the road that RH Quarter should go down. A road of fighting wars across the world for little gain to the people of RH Quarter itself. It will not help our sovereignty, and it will not help us with our neighbors in peace in the Balkans. In fact, I believe it will bring the opposite. It will bring us closer to said path of war and strife. And that is where I will leave it.
Thank you. Now, Justice, you had mentioned that the European Union is likely to throw us, RH Cordia, essentially to the dogs, to Russia, if it ever came to it. However, I may ask, what is our plan if we do not join the European Union? You seem to have some sort of belief that if we do not join, we will be under better circumstances when it comes to Russian interference into our country. However, it does not seem clear to me how joining the EU would weaken our own defense, as the EU actually prompts defense of ourselves. In addition, Greece in itself, independent of the EU, would have a strong incentive to assist us, as they would likely be next if the Russians were ever to come and continue their crusade into the Balkan. So overall, it would not be a negative for RH Cordia to join the EU in the way that you have stated, which um, where the RH Cordia would be essentially sent to Russia as a distraction for the rest of Europe, as there is other incentives that make the EU more likely to want to protect us. And a part of that is to do with trade, as we control the Bosphorus Sea. The Bosphorus Straits, and I do not believe that the EU would want to lose such a valuable piece of ocean, which is very valuable again for containing Russia to the Black Sea. Now, you also mentioned that the EU has no longer been just a solitary economic measure. However, I would argue that it is greater, it is more beneficial for RH Cordia that the EU has become more militarily focused, especially after the collapse of NATO. Um, it essentially makes it more likely that they are able to stand up to Russia. For what would we rather want? A weak economic alliance that's unable to protect us, or a more powerful military alliance that is able to stand up to the military industrial complex of Russia independently from the United States, whose alliances seem to be in flux currently? Um, Overall, the introduction of RH Cordia to the EU would be a far greater development for the nation. It would bring us into greater connection with the rest of Western Europe, have ourselves recognized as a true Western European country by in the eyes of the other Western European countries, and also help us facilitate our economy and military through cooperation with the EU, on top of all of the other measures that I had mentioned previously. Thank you. I will leave my time there.
Thank you, Prime Minister. As laid out, those are some excellent points. However, I still do not believe that we are in the EU's interest, simply due to the fact they do not need us to control the Bosphorus Straits. In a scenario where they're truly selling us out to Russia, they have, you mentioned Greece, that they can turn to instead. It is no secret that Greece has long since held claims on Constantinople, a deal where Greece gains, or rather, I should say, gain Constantinople, since they've never held it since the time of the Eastern Roman Empire. Then we would be obsolete in that scenario and could simply be sold to Russian influence in order to buy time. But as you asked, how would we stand alone without the EU if Russia is not even just a imaginary threat, but a looming threat for RH Cordia? I believe for RH Cordia, the best way forward is to play a role similar to how Turkey did in the early 20th century between the world wars. We stay neutral. We do not interfere with either side, and instead let both sides come to us to make offers in order to get us onto their side, in a bid to get us onto their side, while bringing the same benefits of being in the EU or in Russia's sphere. We will not have to compromise on the sovereignty to either of these states. Additionally, for the notion that we could receive greater recognition and integration from Western European nations to join the EU, I do not believe this to be true, to the fact that we are in the Balkans. That alone will make it only so we could only be called at most honorary Western Europeans. We would never truly be Western Europeans in the eyes of the world. At most, it would be seen as attempting to claim something we aren't, which I don't believe we should. I still believe we should be proud in our heritage and the fact that we are, as once called, the Prussia of the Balkans. And we should honor our heroes who fought to keep Archcordia as it is to this day. Lastly, I'd just like to comment more on how the EU is not what we are looking for our future. As I've previously mentioned, the EU is actively expanding its influence as a major force in global politics. While it could be useful to have a powerful friend, I believe that we are more likely to be swept up under its wings as a sort of subsidiary rather than a true equal partner, especially when compared to the comparably giants of Germany and France. And that is all I have to say.
Now, Justice, you did make some interesting points which I agree with. You said that there are many people, many countries around us which seek our territory. Now, this is a fundamental issue which we as RH Cordia face. However, I do believe that this actually makes it more in our interest to join the EU. You suggested to as an alternative, play off the powers between each other in order to not violate our sovereignty. However, it seems as though to me that would not increase our sovereignty, but merely even further limit our country to the whims of other nations, as we would be confined within what the other two powers would allow us to do. We would have no ability to increase our own personal influence outside of those two, um, which would threaten those two spheres. But also, our many enemies abroad poses a challenge to us in trying to take a neutral position between these two powers, as there are many countries which, even independent of the Russian and European blocs, would love to take a piece out of our nation. For example, the Turkish themselves, which you point out as an example country, would love to have the Straits back. In addition, Russia unofficially supports several nations such as the Romanians, while the EU obviously supports the Greeks. What is to say that these two powers don't turn a blind eye towards our neighbors, instead cannibalizing us in order to increase their own personal power if they see that we are unwilling to join either side? If we join the EU, on the other hand, the Russians will not dare try to infringe on our territorial sovereignty with their pseudo-allies such as the Romanians. Already, the Romanians and Russians have tried to trigger a territorial loss in the triggering of many insurrectionary groups in Dobruja. It is clear evidence that Russia attempts and wants to expand their influence deeper into us, and will do so at any cost. Now, I understand your fears for limiting our own sovereignty. However, it is not as though we will be surrendering all of our autonomy to the EU. We will not be joining the Eurozone. This is not something that is within this proposal. Of course, if there is support for it in the future, we will, for it is the will of the people. However, this proposal specifically only suggests us joining their economic pact, and as well as their military pact, which undeniably limits the amount of enemies we have in our local region, and also helps us to develop economically, as we will have the support of the other European states. As to your point about us not being a Western European nation, I say it may be time to give up on our title of Prussia and the Balkans, and instead modernize to become the Germany of the Balkans, as so too did Prussia evolve from being a warlike state to an economic powerhouse. So shall we. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I think that's a wrap from us with this debate. Thank you all for watching. And remember, if you wish to participate in Irish Quarter or Estelaria, our sister country in the Balkans, make sure to join the links below. And we look forward to seeing you there.